Fantastic. I think the majority of you are in from the waiting room. So welcome to Avid Reader Online. Thank you for joining us on Zoom this evening for a discussion of The Countess from Kirribilli by Joyce Morgan. Before we begin, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land of which I'm currently on in Meanjin, Brisbane, which is the Yagara and Turrbal people, as well as the traditional owners of the lands from which you're all joining us from on Zoom tonight across the country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. For our audience, you will be muted tonight, but you're welcome to have your video on. If you have any questions, just type them into the chat box and I will answer them. And just make sure in the top right-hand corner where it says view, you're set to speaker view. That way you'll be able to see Deborah and Joyce in full screen. And I'm about to send through a link of where you can purchase your copy of the book into the chat box. And it will pop up with a little notification, which will show you how to use the chat box function, which will be very important for our little Q&A session that we'll have towards the end of the event at around 7:20. But please feel free to type in your questions as they pop into your head throughout the event, and then I'll pass them along to Joyce at the end. Next, I'd love to introduce you to our conversation partner for tonight, Deborah Jones. Deborah worked for The Australian for 25 years, including 10 years as arts editor and 3 as editor of the Weekend Australian's review section. In what passes for retirement, she writes about dance, opera, musicals, and theatre for national and international publications. Over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Jana, and hello, everybody. Well, Joyce, thank you so much for bringing Elizabeth von Arnim back into our view. But how did you come across her and when?
I came across her quite a few years ago now. It was when a film was made of one of her books called The Enchanted April, which is probably one of her most popular book. And there was quite a good film with Joan Plowright and Miranda Richardson in it. And it's a story about 4 rather unhappy London women who escape the rotten English weather, and they go off and rent a sort of castello in Italy for a month. And I thought it was quite an interesting film, and I read the book after that. That led me to the book. And I was quite taken with her wit in that book. And it's a very optimistic and romantic book. And then I went looking at her other work, and the one I read was called Vera, which is almost like the opposite extreme of it's dark and it's gothic. And I was like really intrigued that how a woman who wrote such an optimistic book on the one hand also produced such a dark and gothic book. And who was this woman? And then I learned that she was Australian and born in Sydney. And I was very, very surprised because, you know, by then I'd realized she had been a huge literary success in the early 20th century. And I started looking into her life and thought, my goodness, she's led a remarkable life, very eventful life, as both a European countess and a successful novelist. And I thought, how come we have forgotten her name? She's fallen through the cracks of history. So I thought she merited rescuing from that. And I thought there was a great tale to tell. And that was what led me to deciding to write a biography about her.
Well, can you take us back to Kirribilli? Let's start at the beginning with Elizabeth von Arnim, who of course was not Elizabeth von Arnim at all at that point. So who was she?
She was born in 1866 and her name then was Mary Annette Beecham. And she was born into a very prosperous family in Sydney. Her father was an Englishman and he had come out to Australia, to Sydney as a young man, and he'd made quite a fortune in import-export business. Importing and exporting everything from kangaroo skins from Van Diemen's Land to claret from Europe and opium, presumably from China. So he'd made a lot of money, but his he married a woman from Tasmania. Elizabeth's mother had grown up really in quite in poverty in Tasmania. So she didn't have a prosperous background at all. But by the time Elizabeth was born in 1866 as the youngest of 6 kids, they were so wealthy that they moved across to Kirribilli Point, which then was just a place where there was a number of maritime villas. The only one still standing today is Admiralty House, the Governor General's residence, Sydney residence. But they lived there, and they spent, quite a number of years living on Kirribilli Point. Elizabeth was only about 3.5 when the family decided to go back to England for what was supposed to be a 12-month holiday. And so they sailed out of Circular Quay for what, this supposedly brief visit. And but in fact, things turned out very differently. And Elizabeth, in fact, never returned to Australia. So although, she was born here and, spent her early years in Australia, I don't think we can claim her in that sense as an Australian novelist. I think that would probably not, you can't do that. But she certainly, her family kept a lot of ties with Australia, particularly her father. He came back here a couple of times. He was very fond of Australia and had a lot of business contacts, which he maintained throughout his life.
Joyce, can I just take a slight detour back to Louis, Elizabeth or Mary's mother? Mm-hmm. She seems as if she might be worthy of a book all of her own, because the circumstances of her upbringing were quite, impoverished, disastrous, really. How did she come to be in Sydney to marry this wealthy Englishman who may have really been the kind of person to marry someone quite different? And yet here he is, he marries Louis. Mary is one of the many children of that marriage. What is Louis's influence, do you think, on Mary's character? Because she's very, very different from Charles, her father.
Yeah, look, Louis was a very different personality. She was, obviously she was very determined because she got out of this terrible situation in Tasmania. And what had happened was she had basically been abandoned as a teenager when her father, who was newly widowed, he'd lost his wife, he decided to skip off to California to the gold fields, despite the fact that he was actually a lay preacher. He, a Wesleyan minister, and he's always known as the Reverend. And he skipped off there and basically left Louis, and she had a sister on the farm, where a relative from Melbourne came across and rescued them. Eventually, Louis came to Sydney, where she had an older brother who he'd been, a farmhand, but he had started to make his way into business, and he became so successful as running a wholesale. He started in an ironmongery business, but he'd built himself up, and eventually Louis's brother was called Fred, so Elizabeth's uncle Fred Lassiter, was one of Sydney's wealthiest men. He founded a retail empire that was, something like the Maya Empire, although there's big chain stores. He was actually the forerunner of those retail empires, and the empire he established in Sydney, it ran to 4 city blocks. So it was, it had a footprint bigger than Harrods. It was huge. So that was the world in which he, had entered, and his sister obviously, in a sense, rode on her brother's coattails. He took care of her once she came to Sydney.
So we're talking a lot of new money here, really. Yes. It's that kind of freewheeling early days of Sydney thing. So very, very different from the life that Mary grows up into in London after they've gone there. I mean, it's a big quirk of fate in many ways that Louis marries Mary's father. He's wealthy. She's got a brother who has a lot of new money. And then they go to London and they become something quite else, I think.
Yes, look, back in London, the Elizabeth's family, the Beauchamp family, they are mixing in quite elevated societies. They become associated with the former Lord Mayor of London, and Elizabeth grows up. She's presented in court to Queen Victoria. So it's they were still middle class, but they were an socially ambitious family. So they were mixing in that quite different world to Australia, where, in Australia, okay, lots of people haven't, it was a place where people made their fortunes, whereas England was much more, traditional by that sense. There wasn't the sense of new money or opportunity in that sense. The class system was more rigid, but nonetheless, they lived very well. They lived in Hampstead. They went off and lived in Switzerland for a year or so. And Henry, Elizabeth's father, through it all, he kind of kept making and losing fortunes, including in bank collapses in Australia. He still had a lot of money here. So it was slightly precarious. I mean, in some ways, they seemed to me to perhaps live a little beyond their means. They always had very lavish houses and quite a lavish lifestyle. So it was quite a rare, a privilege. It was a very privileged world,
but occasionally precarious.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah.
But how does then Mary come to marry into Prussian aristocracy? She marries someone who is actually not terribly distant from Frederick the Great.
Yes, he was related. He was like a great to Frederick the Great. His father, I think, was the grandson. The way that came about was Elizabeth was in her early 20s and not married, hadn't shown very much interest in marriage, had actually pursued, she'd been studying music at the Royal College of Music, and she was a very accomplished organist. And her father, I think, or the parents decided really it was time that she got married. So her father took her off on the grand tour of Europe. This is in the sort of 1890s. And he took her to Rome. And at a musical evening in Rome, in walked this distinguished Prussian aristocrat by the name of the Count Henning von Arnim. And they had a whirlwind romance. He was quite a bit older than her. He was about 15 years older. He'd been married and recently widowed. But he pursued Elizabeth, or Mary as she still was then, pursued her and proposed within a matter of weeks. Now, this was a very different world entirely to the world, the privileged world even that the Beauchamps lived in London. Because as a Prussian aristocrat, he was, very much from this, real blue blood aristocratic circle. His friends he was quite close to the Wagner family. They were family friends. He was musical too, and one of his teachers his piano teacher had been Franz Liszt. So that was the sort of world in which he lived.
So Joyce, why would he marry this no one? It's a highly unusual match, surely, for a man like that to make.
It's a very unusual match. I mean, I think a part of it was that, he was recently widowed. He'd lost his wife and child. So only about a year beforehand. And, Elizabeth was, then young, from a totally different world entirely. I mean, it is quite mysterious. how they really got together, because initially they didn't even speak the same language. They had to keep it, well, I suppose they spoke the language of love, but they had to communicate in French. So they couldn't really communicate, talk together.
So Joyce, sorry for interrupting, Joyce, but do you think she really loved him? I reading your book, I can't really quite work that out.
Look, I'm not convinced she did. I mean, there are letters that her mother wrote home to a relative saying, oh, she's so devoted to him, and all this kind of thing. But in one way, I think she knew she had to marry. That there wasn't really an alternative for a young, well-brought-up young woman in the 1890s. There was no alternative. Yeah, you really had to get married unless you're going to become, I don't know, governess or something like that. So in that sense, it would have, for her, been a very good match. She was an independent woman, so I don't think, and at least the thought of having to then go off and leave her family behind in England when she moved to Prussia rather, in Germany, that wouldn't really have bothered her. But I think she was extremely ill prepared for marriage. And
the number of children that she had very quickly. We know, as you've mentioned, that she was very musical, and so she did have this artistic bent. She had these children. And I think there were difficulties in the marriage. You refer at one point in the Countess from Kirribilli to a time when Henning strikes Mary, and she's, very, very taken aback by that, not surprisingly. But she finds obviously solace and a way of being in her writing. So when did she start writing?
She started writing in her 30s. She began when they'd moved from Berlin, where they lived initially. They'd moved from there to he had a large estate, a rural estate, up near the Baltic in a place in Pomerania. So they moved there, and she loved there. She loved, this forested and quiet natural world. And she had, several children by then. And I think it was a bit of a refuge for her that she started writing. And much to her great surprise, she wrote the first book she wrote was a fictional, sort of like a year in her life, a fictional version of what her life was like living in Pomerania. And she romanticized things, but it was very witty. And quite spiky in some ways. And she referred to her husband as the man of wrath, and he was, pontificating kind of all over the place. So it was called Elizabeth and Her German Garden, and it sounds terribly florid, but it's more about her attempts to establish a garden, and rather not terribly well. But also it's social observation of the characters. It's not a novel as such. It's like a fictional journal. Anyway, I think nobody was more surprised than her when this book that was published in 1898 became an international success. It became a huge bestseller on both sides of the Atlantic, and including in Australia. It became really, really popular. Even though she insisted her name not appear on it. It was published anonymously, and she wrote to her publisher and said, she hinted it was for family reasons, because in one sense it didn't do for a Pomeranian countess, which she was then. She was Countess von Arnim, so it didn't do for her to be sullying her hands writing commercial fiction. But I think there was another reason as well. And I think it went to the fact that she actually poked fun at the Germans in that book for the first, but certainly not for the last time. And I think she would not have wanted the trail of authorial breadcrumbs to have come back to her. So I think although she didn't explain this. I think this is the reason that she insisted this book become anonymous.
But Joyce, she was outed quite early, wasn't she? I mean, she denied it when she was outed, and people did. They decided that there were various other people who were candidates for being the author of this book, but she wasn't really able to maintain that anonymity, really, was she, for all that long?
She maintained it for a couple of years, and in one way it became, perhaps unwittingly, an incredible publicity, not a stunt, because I don't say it was deliberate, but it became the source of like full-page articles in New York and San Francisco, in the Daily Mail. Kel surprise, who is this woman? Who is Elizabeth? Because she'd followed up her first book with several books, and they were only described as, they'd have the title of them, but then it would simply say, by the author of Elizabeth and Her German Garden. Very clunky title. So that was all people knew. So the speculation was just ran hot, not just in the sort of popular press, but in the sort of more literary end. There was speculation in journals there about who was behind Elizabeth, and all sorts of names were run up the flagpole, largely of aristocratic women who probably had never lifted pens in their life, but there was Princess Henry of Pless and Princess someone of somewhere else, and so various aristocrats were, their names, kept being, so it's a bit like, a modern day Elana Ferrante, so who's behind this? After a couple of years, she was outed, and she, through all of this, she denied it. She was very capable of bald-faced lies when she needed to. So she would insist to her publisher, "Look, you've got to deny that, I am the author of this." And the publisher would dutifully issue a denial, knowing full well who it was. So it was a couple of years later when she was, outed as Countess von Arnim, and one paper even traced it back to, named her as, like, they called her May Beauchamp, not Mary Beauchamp, daughter of Henry Beauchamp, blah blah blah. And I found that interesting because the name May Beauchamp was her family's nickname for her. So I can't help but wonder if the family were not somehow involved in actually outing her, because they were quite proud of what she was doing.
Well, I don't know, Joyce, it might have been one of the quite modern things, like the Daily Mail slipping them a few pounds or something to spill the beans. It's been known to happen, hasn't it? Joyce, we should actually talk about the books themselves. I think, really, how good was Elizabeth von Arnim? And really, why has she been forgotten? If she was, because she was very, very popular, very successful.
Yeah, look, she was hugely popular, and she had a lot of literary acclaim. Like her last book, for example, which she wrote 21 books altogether. And her last one, Time magazine, named as one of its books of the year. So, that's the sort of fame and status that she had. Of those 20 odd books, I don't think they all stack up. But at least half a dozen of them, I think, are fantastic. And what characterizes them is her wit. She was witty and satirical. She was often compared with Jane Austen in her lifetime.
And she loved Pride and Prejudice too, which of course naturally recommends her to all of us, I think.
She did love that. She used to read it and reread it, and she'd say every time she found new things in it. So she certainly absolutely loved Jane Austen. I think like one of the common themes in her book is there's often a woman on the run, and so the women are running from marriage, they're running from motherhood, they're running from dreadful husbands, they're running from society's pressures, and all of her books were semi-autobiographical. They're not always based on literal truth, but they are, there's an emotional truth. and many of the stories are rooted in her own life. So, and that's the paradox, you know, this incredibly private woman who actually was writing semi-autobiographical books. It's, you know, one of the many paradoxes about her.
Yes.
So if I had to name, you know, the ones that I think really stand up today, they would include those two that I've first mentioned, that I read, The Enchanted April and Vera. But also I particularly like one called Expiation. Again, terrible title, but it's actually a great story about a widow who has had a long-standing affair. Not a passionate affair, it's kind of developed into sort of like, you know, warm and cozy by the time she becomes a widow. And it's about society's treatment of her. There's another one called Love, which is about a much older woman marrying a younger man. And I think that was very much informed by Elizabeth had a long-standing affair after she was widowed, and after a second marriage ended, she had a long-standing affair with a man who was half her age. She was well into her 50s, and he was a Cambridge graduate in his 20s. And so she wrote a book that's, you know, in some ways grounded in this relationship and in the sort of double standards of how the way in which an older woman with a younger man is treated. So yeah, that's simply called Love. And I think that one is certainly worthwhile reading. There's another couple, there's one called The Caravanners, about a caravanning trip she did around England, which was all the vogue in sort of, you know, around the time of Wind in the Willows, except her book was before Wind in the Willows. You know, everyone was in caravans and having, or not everyone, aristocrats were trying to kind of live like bohemians in caravans. And that was based on a trip she took in England with her family. That one is quite a spiky book. But that one is one that Patrick White thought was one of the funniest books that he'd ever read. He was a great fan of Elizabeth von Arnim. And that one, in some ways, it's a bit too bellicose for me, because there's the German character in that. There's a German baron who is really, you know, he's chauvinistic and you know, hates the British, is a truly foul character. But it's interesting because it's the only book that's written it's written from the Baron's perspective, you know, and he damns himself with just about every line he utters. So it's quite a curious one. So yeah, there's at least half a dozen. But although she was very witty and socially observant, she also wrote very beautifully about nature, and that's a side of her writing I actually really, really love. She writes there's a book called In the Mountains that has quite a bit of nature writing in it, and one called The Adventures of Elizabeth on Rügen, which is an island off the Baltic. And they are both have a lot of really lyrical, lovely nature writing. I mean, they're witty as well, but they have that side. So there's at least half a dozen that I think are well worth reading.
Look, and she was very, very witty. If we can go back to Vera, which I'd also like to talk about too, because of the association that it has with her second husband and the extraordinarily difficult time she had with him. But in Vera, she has Miss Entwistle, who is is she the aunt or the cousin?
She's the auntie, yes.
She's the aunt of Lucy, the young woman involved. And Miss Entwistle has an old friend, a widow, who she says is full of that ripe wisdom that sometimes comes at the end to those who have survived marriage. Whoa. And she says of someone else, someone has 2 houses, no children, much better than the other way round. So that is very Jane Austen-ish, I think. So one can see how people would make that connection. However, of course, Vera, while it does have these kind of little these nuggets of wit, is, well, it's a horror story, really, and it is very much based on Elizabeth von Arnim's second marriage to Frank, the hideous Frank. Tell us about Frank.
Frank. Okay. Frank, or to give him his full title, the second Earl Russell, Francis Russell, was the older brother of Bertrand Russell, the great philosopher and Nobel Prize winner. Frank, however, was a very different character to Bertrand Russell. Frank was he was a member of the House of the Lords. He was a bully, and he was a bigamist. He'd been a convicted bigamist by the time Elizabeth met him and became romantically involved with him, which was around about 1914. She was involved with Frank. She'd been widowed several years by then. But Frank had a lot of, he was a very eloquent speaker in the House of Lords. He was much admired for his eloquence, and that was the side I think that she was initially drawn to. But Frank turned out to be a classic case of coercive control. He within about 6 months of their marriage, Elizabeth was writing to her then adult daughter from her first marriage, saying, like, I'm virtually in prison. I have to ask his permission if I want to go outside, even for a walk. And even when I ask permission, invariably there's bad blood, as she called it, bad blood. So he was a man of extreme moods, possibly exacerbated by the use of cocaine. He was also a gambler. He had obviously quite an addictive personality. So high stakes gambling. So, not for nothing, he was dubbed the Wicked Earl. But she married him, even knowing a lot of his history. She had been completely beguiled by him somehow. Anyway, it unraveled very quickly. And within the space of, it took her a couple of years, but she left him. And she wrote this book called Vera that was based on that controlling marriage. And that book came out, it's its 100th anniversary this year. It came out. Oh, really? Yeah. Yes, it came out in 1921. And it actually, when it came out, Vera actually set the salons of London agog, because although she called her the domestic tyrant of this book by another name, many of her associates and his recognized him. They knew exactly who it was based on. And of course he was furious. He threatened to sue. He sent foul letters, including to his brother Bertrand Russell. He sort of badmouthed her around London, called her a vulgar little hedonist, and so he totally was furious. In the end, he didn't sue. I think Bertrand Russell tried to talk him out of it, and I think he realized that if he had gone ahead, he may have won the battle, if you like, but he certainly would have lost the court of public opinion. I mean, he was a very visible figure. Anyway, it's actually, the strange thing is, when you mentioned about how she's fallen through the cracks, it's actually weirdly through that book Vera and her marriage to Frank Russell that she was republished in the 1980s. And she'd gone out of print after she died during World War II. So she died in 1941 and her books went out of print. Now, what happened was in the 1980s, the publishing house Virago, that headed by Carmel Khalil, the formidable Australian publisher, she was publishing books by women, women writers, and particularly neglected women writers. One of the writers that she published was Dora Russell. Dora Russell was married to Bertrand Russell. And Dora drew Carmen's attention to the backstory of Vera. Basically, look, this was based on Elizabeth's marriage to my brother-in-law. And it was the result of that. Carmen decided, she was aware of von Arnim's writing, but she decided to republish Vera, and after that a number of her other books. So she sort of came back into attention in the 80s a little bit through that. So yeah, that's the irony of the disastrous marriage to Frank Russell.
Vera, I found interesting because it reminded me somewhat of Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, and I would be far from the only person who would have noticed that. Named after a dead first wife whose spectre kind of hangs over a very young, inexperienced second wife. Now, do you think that Daphne du Maurier was aware of Vera, or is it just that there's superficial similarities and we shouldn't, put too much credence on the notion that du Maurier kind of copied it?
Look, I think there's a lot of similarities, in the premise, of a young second wife going to this rather Gothic home of the husband to find that a shadow of a previous wife hangs over that Gothic house. It differs greatly beyond that, particularly the nature of the first wife, the haunted wife sort of thing. But it's hard to imagine that Daphne du Maurier wasn't aware of Vera. I don't think she ever said that she was, but because Vera was so popular, it seems to beg a belief that she wouldn't have been familiar with that book when she wrote Rebecca. Rebecca, of course, is a much better known book than Vera, and Daphne du Maurier, remains a much bigger name. But I think it's highly likely. From what I can see, one of the few writers who really acknowledged an influence of von Arnim on her writing was a British writer called Barbara Pym, who again is a very witty kind of social observation. And she's acknowledged it, but as far as I know, Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier didn't ever acknowledge that she had read that book.
Joyce, how difficult was it to get the kind of information you need to write a full biography of someone who, for at least a few years, was determined to say that she was in fact not the author, someone who had a very tumultuous life, someone who travelled around a great deal? How difficult was it for you to pin her down through primary sources and whatever? How did you go about this task?
Well, the way I approached it, I was really blessed with the fact that Elizabeth left diaries throughout her life. Not quite for every year. There's certain times, curious times, when they'd go silent, often when there was some terrible thing and she just couldn't speak and write her diaries. But for most of her life, she did write diaries. And not only did she write diaries, she was a great correspondent. She'd often write up to 30 letters a day. So a lot of those letters still exist, like thousands of them. They were all at a library in America, which is where Elizabeth died. She died in America, and her letters and journals, as well as her father's letters and journals, are in a library called the Huntington, which is on the edge of Los Angeles in Pasadena. Beautiful library set in 100 acres of gardens, which is highly recommended if we can ever get on planes back to Los Angeles. I think we can actually now, can't we? Anyway, They're all there. There's mountains. So I went through thousands and thousands of pages of diaries and letters, and plus I also I gathered letters from other collections. So some were in the Bertrand Russell archives, which are in Canada. Some were in H.G. Wells's collection, because she appears to have had a very stormy relationship with H.G. Wells, the sci-fi writer. So there's correspondence there. So that's scattered, but the bulk of it is in Pasadena in Los Angeles. So I spent many happy hours and weeks and going through those. And what I found really interesting was, because her books were semi-autobiographical, was to look at what was going on in her life at the time she was writing a particular book. And sometimes I'll give you one example of something that I found really curious. She only ever wrote one children's book, and she wrote that, around about 1900. And it was when her kids were very small. And this book was illustrated by Kate Greenaway, who is a British illustrator who did lovely, I can see some people nodding, familiar with Kate Greenaway, lovely romantic illustrations. So 3 of her little girls appeared in this story. And it's all Easter egg hunts and sleigh rides, and it's just charming. At that time, however, the time she was writing it, her husband, the Count von Arnim, was in jail. He'd been arrested and accused of embezzlement and financial dodgy dealings, possibly trumped up. He was acquitted later, but nonetheless, she was left alone in the home on the estate in Pomerania. She was left alone. All the relatives, the German relatives, seemed to abandon her. She was left alone to run the estate. She not only had her 3 girls who were, kind of all under 10, but she had just given birth to a 4th daughter, who was only a few weeks old when the Count was arrested. So these are the circumstances in which she was writing that book. And I just think that, she was a very, very resilient, whatever you may think about Elizabeth, and she wasn't always likable. She behaved very badly at times. However, her resilience was extraordinary. And she, whether it was a refuge to produce that book, it no doubt would have helped with the legal fees that would have been substantial from his trial. But she carried on, and that book, of course, was very successful. But that was what what really hit me, when I could put the books beside her journals and the letters. I found them really revealing.
Yeah, she was really an extraordinary survivor, wasn't she? In that incredibly difficult life she had in many ways, not good relationships often with her children, from time to time a daughter who dies when she's 16, the difficult marriages, the way in which she, I guess, took on the persona of Countess, and seemed to enjoy that. But I kind of felt that maybe that was a bit of a shield for her also. And yet she just goes through it all. She writes these books. She has this immense, immense success, and never lets any of this, bow her down. Did you find her very admirable? Did you like her when you were researching her?
Look, I certainly admired her, and I admired her resilience and her wit and her strength. I think she made some bad choices. I think she could treat people appallingly at times. She could be, for example, E.M. Forster never forgave her for teasing him as a young man when he came out to tutor her children. And she behaved pretty appallingly to him. I think she was getting a little bit bored with Pomerania by then, frankly, but and certainly starved of intellectual companies. I mean, by then I think she realized the Count von Arnim was, basically interested in his pigs and his potatoes, not much else. But so she could be very cruel to people and devastating. But they were very, her bad behavior towards them tend to, she could flip-flop, she could change like a summer storm. So I don't think they were all, like long-running hostilities or anything like that. But nonetheless, extremely hurtful. And, some of her behavior, I think, was, she didn't behave well. She did like the trappings, I think, of being a countess, and the wealth and position that provided her. And I think that, at least initially, was very much a source of friction with her younger cousin, Catherine Mansfield, the New Zealand writer. Catherine and Elizabeth didn't meet until Elizabeth was in about her 50s, I think, and Catherine was in her 20s or early, something like that, early 30s, still was ill with TB that eventually killed Catherine. And they met in London, and there's a note that Catherine wrote to a friend, and Catherine Mansfield's journals were another great source. She wrote and said, "Oh, Elizabeth's coming tomorrow, she's going to be dripping in furs and feathers," and in fact she was. And then leaves this terrible description of Elizabeth eating bread and butter with her hands crawling like little parasites, bejeweled parasites towards the bread. It's absolutely withering. And I think part of it was Catherine may have been a little bit jealous, because at that point, Elizabeth was like really successful, wealthy, big deal writer, and Catherine was sort of struggling away to make a name for herself. So I think she did. Elizabeth did like the trappings, but I certainly found her ability to push through whatever was thrown at her really admirable.
Can I then segue to an earlier book of yours, Journeys on the Silk Road, which has the most incredible hero, I think, a man called Oral Stein. He also incredibly tenacious, lived much earlier than, or somewhat earlier than well, am I right in saying that he lived much earlier than
they're actually pretty much contemporaries.
They might be contemporaries, actually. I realise that, yeah. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit very quickly, because we've only got about 5 minutes before we get to questions. Tell me about Oral Stein and what drove that man to do the amazing adventuring and exploration that he did on the Silk Roads, and tell us what he found.
Okay. Oral Stein was a Hungarian-born explorer, and what I guess he has in common with Elizabeth was he is another figure who's fallen through the cracks of history, and I thought had an extraordinary life and story to tell. I was particularly interested in he spent a lot of his life in Asia and Central Asia, and one of the journeys that I followed of his was an expedition he made into the west of China, where he came across these Buddhist caves that were beautifully painted, frescoes, and within one of those caves was a hidden library. And it had been hidden for 1,000 years, sealed up, a sacred library full of scrolls and silk paintings and things. And he ran off with it to England, to the British Museum. Actually did in those days, but that's another question. But the great treasure of what he took with him and is now in the British Library and preserved is a copy of the world's oldest printed book. Now, it's not the Gutenberg Bible. It's 500 years older than that. It's a Buddhist text by the name of the Diamond Sutra. So I was interested in, how that got to England, became the great treasure of the British Library, and this extraordinary Hungarian man who was, like Elizabeth, somewhat eccentric, lived whenever he could on a mountainside in Kashmir. And I think one of the reasons he's forgotten is he was still exploring in his 80s when he was in Afghanistan, had a heart attack, and he's buried in the Christian section of a graveyard in Kabul.
Yes, I would very much like to recommend to everyone that they read Journeys from the Silk Road, which Joyce wrote with her husband Conrad. It is just such a cracking read. I mean, as is the Countess from Kirribilli, don't get me wrong, very, very, very different. But R.L. Stine, what an amazing, amazing man. Walking through the most inhospitable territory, often presumably just with a compass to guide him to some little mound that would, tell him turn left here, something like that. Just really extraordinary. So I absolutely commend that to you people if you love a jolly good read. And you've obviously already read The Countess from Kirribilli. So that put this one onto your reading list next. Now, Jana, are we now at question time?
Yes, we've had a few come in. I think some of them may have kind of been answered, so I'll try to sort through them. Let's start with Nicole's question. She says, this is for you, Joyce. Do you think Elizabeth was too self-absorbed to be a good mother? Did she only have children to appease Henning?
Look, that's a very astute question. I think she was a very reckless mother. I think she spent a lot of her time. I think she had postnatal depression after the children. She certainly didn't want to have child after child. But he insisted, he wanted the son and heir, and she kept producing daughters. So she had 5 children before she produced the son. I think, in her own way, she did, grow up. She did love the children, but she could be, she could be quite cruel and harsh to them, and particularly in the case of the youngest daughter, which is, one of the most, to my mind, the difficult aspects of her story, because she fell out with her daughter, banished her as a teenager back to Germany. Then the war erupted, didn't even kiss her goodbye. Refused to have contact with her. Then the war came along, the First World War, and the girl died during the war of pneumonia. Anyway, that's it's a terrible, terrible sequence of events that all stemmed from, I think, Elizabeth just in a fit of pique banishing the girl because she'd been accused of theft at her school. I don't think she was very well suited to motherhood. It's clear from her letters that she did love her children, and she was very close to one daughter particularly, her daughter Libet actually wrote a sort of memoir, the first biography really of Elizabeth in the 50s, based on some of her letters. And she was very close to there, but even Libet, acknowledges that there was a lot of difficulties in, Elizabher's rather reckless approach to motherhood. And yes, so I don't think she, she certainly didn't want to have all those children. I think she found it very hard. I mean, apart from anything else, she was only 5 foot tall. She was only tiny, had a very tiny frame. I think she got very sick afterwards and very depressed, and that really took its toll on her. Yeah.
And Nicole had a bit of a follow-up question, which you kind of touched on before, but it was, do you think if you met her in person that you would like her? And you didn't exactly say yes or no. You just kind of said that she was a lot. She was a bit of a character. But I wonder if we were to frame that question as if you did meet her, how would you want your relationship to be? Would you be frenemies? Would you keep her at an arm's distance? Would you try have her in your back pocket?
I don't think I'd ever have her in my back pocket. No, I'd love to talk to her. I mean, she was, very erudite and witty and sparkly. She would be a fun person. I think one of the people commented after she died that, what a devil she was, but what good fun. So I think there were these two aspects of her, that her father pointed to. She could be, she could be, very extreme. She, so I think look, I would love to meet her. I think I would enjoy her company. I wouldn't have wanted to rely on her for anything, but I think I would certainly have enjoyed sitting next to her at a dinner or something like that. I think she would have been extremely good fun.
So we'll call her a small dose friend, where you just want her in small doses. Sarah wants to know about your research. And so how long did the research for the whole book take? And then how long did it take to write the book?
Okay, so I spent 3 years working on the book and of that, I probably split it like half and half research, half writing. I mean, I spent 2 months going in Los Angeles at the library, but a lot of that was just gathering material. So I had to kind of process it, more deeply when I got home. And I was doing a lot of reading around the area around that time, that period. Some of the people who she crossed paths with, I was reading some of their material. So that was probably about half and half. And that's kind of typically how I work when I'm writing books. And this one, The Countess, was the most intensely archival work, dealing with letters. I did another book about Martin Sharp, the pop artist, Australian pop artist, and that was more interview based. There wasn't much in the way of letters. That was more interviews. And after I'd done that, I was, kind of felt like I wanted a change, and I like working in libraries and archives. I'm never happier than when I'm sitting in an archive. And so that was really where I found my source, all the primary material. So yeah, about half and half at that time.
And then in terms of your primary versus your secondary resources, did you find you had to do a lot of primary?
Yeah, for The Countess, absolutely. Yeah. Because I mean, I wanted to go, I thought if you're writing a biography, you need to go back to, and a whole of life biography, as I was doing Cradle to the Grave, you need to go back to primary material. You can't write it just from what's already on the record. And I found because she was such a mysterious figure, there was an awful lot of myths around her that had kind of ended up as, as facts somehow. And so I wanted to go back and see, well, pull it apart and go, yeah, what's really going on there? So that was why I wanted to go back to primary sources. I think, they were the absolute, they're the clay, they're the gold. And that, yes, it was a mountain of material, but that was really how, I approached it, was to do just that. Yeah.
And you did mention you did travel a bit for your research. Was there anywhere else other than Los Angeles you did some field research?
Los Angeles was the main place. I had planned to go to England to look at some of Catherine Mansfield's papers. There's not a lot in England, but there's some of her Catherine Mansfield's, some of Elizabeth's. There's a few letters in the British Library, but COVID came along, so I was able to work remotely and get what I needed. And I was just so thankful that I'd had that time in the Huntington in LA before, because I'd only been back a few weeks when we started hearing about COVID, and then it wouldn't have been possible. So I kind of think, God, my timing in that sense was so fortunate. I mean, I've looked around, Sydney, of course, to see, is there anything that exists today that connects with her life? But of course, the house in which she grew up has long gone. In fact, there's very little to recognize at all. There's a bronze statue of her, but that's in Poland. I mean, yeah, and that's near, the estate that was in Pomerania, since the war is now in Poland, and that's about all there is to recognize her, which I think is a great shame. But yeah, there's very little. But we have her books. That's her legacy. So yeah.
And we'll finish on a question from Nicole. And she says, do you think that Elizabeth eventually found happiness?
Well, Nicole, I think she went through periods of happiness. I think towards the end of her life, I think if she went to America during, as World War II, she fled, and she had several family members over there. Two of her daughters and her son were in America by that stage. I think she went through periods when she was intensely happy. At the end of her life, I think she was lonely. She missed Europe. I think she probably would have been a lot lonelier if she realized she was never going back to Europe. I think she left Europe in a hurry because she was just going to sit out the war, and that's not what happened. But so I think, she was happy in as much as she led a very full and successful life, but I think she was lonely. I think she would have liked the companionship of a lover or a partner, but she, those things didn't work out too well for her. And at various times she said, "Oh, I'm so much happier on my own." But I do think there was, a certain loneliness at the end of her life, especially. And so I couldn't say she found happiness. I think she went through periods when she knew happiness. No doubt she knew happiness, and she felt that.
Well, that brings us to the end of our chat tonight. It's been really fascinating. Thank you so much, Joyce, for this wonderful book and for all that time and hours you've put into it to bring Elizabeth to life. Deborah, do you have any final words you'd like to say?
Just if you haven't already read the book, you're obviously interested in it, go and get it immediately and get Joyce's other books too.
Thank you, Deborah. And thank you, Jana. And thank you all for tuning in. It's been
Thanks,
a great
everyone.
pleasure.
Have a great night, everyone. See you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.